explorers, it's Justin again, and I have a geography challenge for you. Name 3 different states. Any 3 states that come to mind. Ready? Go. And time. All right, here are the ones I picked. The United States, Brazil, and China. Confused? If you live in the US, you might have named states like California, Texas, or Colorado. But what if I told you that all of these places on this world map are actually called states? Now, hear me out before you start arguing with me. In this unit, we're jumping into political geography, looking at maps such as this one to study the relationship between politics and geography. But you'll quickly find that the terms geographers use are a little different than the ones we use in everyday life. So, what is a state? What kinds of states are there in the world, and do people ever make new states? This sounds like the work of a political geographer. Are you ready, explorers? Let's get into it. So, what do I mean when I say that the United States, Brazil, and China are states? Shouldn't I just use the word country or nation? Well, in political geography, these words have different meanings. State and country are very similar, but we'll stick to the word state because that's what we use more often in politics. However, in political geography, the word nation does not have the same meaning as state or country. Instead, a nation is a group of people that have a common identity, like ethnicity, language, culture, history, or shared values. We can look at the US for examples of nations that live there. There are people who identify as American, African American, and there are indigenous nations as well, like the Cherokee in modern-day Oklahoma. So we know that nations of people live inside states, but what does it mean exactly to be a state? Well, you need 4 things to be considered a state. If you're missing even one, other states may not recognize your state, meaning they won't establish a diplomatic relationship or trade with you. First, a state needs territory, or land with clear borders. States also need a population, or people that live in the state. Next, states need a government to make and enforce laws in the state. Finally, states need sovereignty. Sovereignty is when a government can make its own rules and decisions without anyone else telling it what to do. In a sovereign state, everything from laws to the economy to official holidays is up to your state and no one else. And that's all 4 characteristics of a state. All right, ready to put this definition to the test? Here's a pop quiz. In the US, we call California a state. However, political geographers would not call California a state. Which of the 4 characteristics of a state is California missing, and why? Answer this question in your notes. If you need a hint, think about California's relationship with another government in Washington, D.C. Think you got it? California does have territory, a population, and a government, but its government does not have full sovereignty over what happens in California. Why? Well, California is part of the United States, so it also has to follow the laws of the federal U.S. government. So, California does not have full sovereignty, and it is not a state on our world's political map. Keep these 4 characteristics of a state in mind as we continue to learn about the states in our world today. You'll find that not everyone agrees on who meets these requirements to be a sovereign state. All right, now that we know what it takes to be a state on today's political map, let's learn about the different kinds of states and nations we might find in the world. The first type of state we'll look at is the nation state. A nation state is a political body where a group of people with a common identity, a nation, has its own sovereign state. Think of this as a state that is mostly made up of just one nation. The other type of state is the multinational state. This is a state with more than one nation within its borders. These are diverse political bodies, often with several different identity groups in its population. There are also multi-state nations. This would be a group of people who share a common identity but live across multiple states. And finally, there are stateless nations. A stateless nation is a group of people who share a common identity but have no sovereign state to call their own. All right, I know that's a lot, so let's play a little game to practice these new words. I'm going to give you some real-world examples, and I want you to identify what type of state or nation it is and explain why in your notes. No worries if you make any mistakes, just make corrections as we review the answers together. Let's try it out. Our first example is the Somalis. Because European colonists divided Africa into states without considering where the Somalis lived, they are currently in present-day Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Djibouti. What type of state or nation are the Somalis? Since the Somalis are a nation of people that share a common identity but live across multiple states, they are a multi-state nation. Next up is Japan. Historically, being a group of islands made it difficult for people to immigrate there. Also, in the past, the Japanese government enforced strict laws that limited immigration. For these reasons, Japan's population is mostly made up of one nation, the Japanese. What type of state or nation is Japan? Since Japan is a state mostly made up of one nation of people, Japan is a nation-state. Now let's look at Canada. Canada's population is composed of indigenous peoples like the Inuit and Métis nations, the first people to migrate there, the descendants of colonists from Britain and France, and other immigrants from all over the world. What type of state or nation is Canada? Since Canada is a state with more than one nation living inside it, we call it a multinational state. For our last example, let's look at the Kurds. The Kurds have a deep shared culture, language, and history, and they live in Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. However, the Kurds don't have sovereignty over any of these states. What type of state or nation are the Kurds? Since the Kurds are a nation of people that don't have sovereignty over their own state, they are a stateless nation. How'd you do? Make sure you finish your guided notes before moving on, because you'll need to be able to tell the difference between these states and nations to understand political maps of our world. So, for stateless nations like the Kurds, is that it? Is there no hope for having a sovereign state of their own? Absolutely not. Nations throughout history have advocated for a state of their own. When a nation comes together to seek their own sovereign state, we call this a nationalist movement. How do these nationalist movements start? Well, consider the nation or nations of people that you are a part of. Think of your shared culture, history, and values. How do you feel about this shared heritage? You might feel proud about the nation or nations you come from. This feeling you might have of pride in the interests, culture, and values of your nation has a name: nationalism. In the world today, nationalism takes on many forms. For some people, nationalism is simply a celebration of a shared culture and history. For others who believe their nation is better than others, nationalism might lead them to violent extremes. And in the case of stateless nations seeking a sovereign state, this feeling of pride could be the spark for a nationalist movement. Nationalist movements often lead to war, conflict and economic hardship. But for stateless nations throughout history, it's often been worth it. Why do you think stateless nations continue to fight for a sovereign state despite the setbacks? Make this prediction in your notes. Well, if a nation can make a sovereign state, they'll finally be able to make all of their own decisions. This means they can establish their own government and laws, control their own economy and wealth, and they can preserve their nation's culture in their state. Nationalist movements are one of the factors that have radically changed the shape of our world's political map throughout history. And since there are still nations seeking states of their own, who knows what these maps might look like in the future? All right, explorers, now that you have some of the key concepts of political geography under your belt, you're ready to jump into analyzing our political world. Next time, we'll learn about the borders that divide states and what happens when those borders lead to conflict. We'll see you in our next adventure. Until then, keep exploring.
Hey, hey.